2 months ago, I took my Project Camaro for its first drive. And unfortunately, I haven't been able to drive it since then. Because while we were on our first drive, we sprung a huge oil leak, and I've been battling with the car for the last 2 months to try and get it fixed. But I had to take a break from my diagnosing to move my car 800 miles from Kentucky all the way down to Florida. And now that it's settled in, it's time to figure out what's wrong and get it fixed. Now, those of you who have watched my channel for a long time may remember that I have replaced the oil pan gasket on this engine not once, but twice. And now I'm about to do it for a third time because neither of the earlier times have been done correctly. Now, oil pan gaskets come in a slew of different styles. There's cork, there's silicone, there's new, there's old. And originally, when I first put the oil pan gasket on this engine, when I was building it, I used cork gaskets with not enough silicone to seal them properly, and we had huge oil leaks coming out of them right off the bat. Then we upgraded to a silicone one-piece gasket, and when I installed it, I did not seal it properly, and we still had a massive leak. So today, I'm taking the oil pan back off the car, I'm resealing the oil pan gasket, and then with the help of my dad, we're going to put it back on. So here I'm using my engine hoist to pull the engine off of its mounts inside of the engine bay. That will allow us to get enough clearance to pull the entire oil pan off the bottom of the car. Then we're going to drain the oil into a pan so we can reuse this later. It's only got about maybe 5 minutes of runtime on it, so I think it's safe to reuse this oil. Then we wiggle down underneath the engine and start unbolting all of the oil pan bolts one by one, and sure enough, we get the whole oil pan detached and slid out much easier than the last time. Then we bring the oil pan and the gasket over to our workbench to get everything cleaned off. I'm going to use some lacquer thinner to clean the surfaces where the gasket was, and that gets all of the oil and the grime and the gross and the nastiness off of there. And I'm going to do the same thing to the engine block to make sure that our mating surface is perfectly clean. Then we're going to take some RTV that is specifically designed for oil pan gasket sealing, and we're going to put it all the way around the entire border of the pan. This is a big step that I did not do last time, and I think by doing this, it's going to help make sure that everything is totally sealed. So here, my dad and I are putting the oil pan gasket back down on the pan. This is going to squish all of that RTV down just a little bit, make sure that the oil pan gasket sticks to the surface, and by keeping it in place, it allows us to squirt the next layer of RTV onto the top side of the gasket, which will be going against the engine block and sealing the exact same way. So then it was time for the hard part, which was wiggling back underneath the car with our sandwich of gasket maker and gasket and oil pan and getting it pressed up against the bottom of the engine block without smearing anything. That is the big goal here. Get it up there, get it clean, and get it bolted in. Now that is a lot easier said than done. As we were putting the oil pan up against the block, we missed the fact that the oil dipstick tube was still hanging down, and we completely missed the hole that it was supposed to go to. So you can see my dad pulling the oil dipstick out so we can make sure and maneuver around the tube, and this made it a lot easier. Once we got it up against the block, it was pretty easy to get everything bolted in. I was holding it, my dad took the bolts and put them in one by one, just getting them finger tight to hold everything up there, and then we went through and installed all the rest of the small bolts and then torqued them to spec. And that was it. The oil pan was back in. So now the only thing left that we had to do was refill the engine with the oil that we took out. Now again, this has only been run for about 5 minutes, so it's totally fine to reuse it at this point. There were no chunks or metal dust or anything in the oil, which I was very happy to see. And so it just gets put back right into the engine and we're done. Now, just for a comparison, when I did this before, it took me literally 3 days to get this done, and now this only took me about 4 hours. It's amazing how much knowing what you're doing can increase the speed of what you're doing. So now that we've got the oil pan gasket all fixed up and sealed, and we think it's working, it's time to move on to the next thing while that cures. And that brings me to this big box from Jegs. Now, the first and least interesting thing in this box is some new vacuum tubing, and that's going to be for our transmission modulator when we get all that ready to be hooked up. But what's really cool in here is this box. Now in here should be one of the most crucial components for getting the Camaro running under its own power again, and that is this beautiful mechanism right here. Now this is the fuel pickup for our gas tank, which we just refinished before moving back down here to Florida. This thing comes with a new O-ring, new locking disc, and all the tubes that need to go out to our hard lines that will take it up to the engine. And of course, we've got an electronic float to let us know if our fuel tank is full or empty. Now, in addition to the new fuel pickup, we also have brand new fuel lines. Now, these are gonna run all the way underneath the car from the front to the back to our fuel tank, where this little hook here should connect into that hook over there, and that's what's gonna deliver fuel from our tank all the way back to the engine, so we don't have to use that little red jug that I had just ratchet strapped to the front of the car anymore. So our next step is gonna be taking the fuel tank back off of the car so we can put the pickup in, and then we'll secure all the new lines to the bottom of the car. So without further ado, let's get fueling. So with our fuel tank removed, I wanted to take a peek inside of it to see what was in there. So I turned my phone on, started recording, and this is what it looks like inside the fuel tank. I was honestly unbelievably shocked at how clean and crisp the inside of this tank is. There is no visible rust. It looks super, super good, and we are definitely going to be able to use this for basically the lifetime of the car. But even though the metal is good, it's still really dirty inside, so I'm going to pour some gasoline in there, swish it around a little bit, and dump it out and see what kind of treasures we find. And this is why you should always clean out your fuel tank before you hook it up, because all of this trash would have been inside there floating around and could have gotten sucked up by something and ruined our whole fuel system. So with the fuel tank all cleaned out, it's time to put the pickup in. Now this is a pretty straightforward process. You put the new O-ring in there, you put the pickup in there, and then you put the locking disc on top, and it kind of just locks in there using a screwdriver and a hammer. We hammer it around to tighten it down, and that is pretty much the entire install. This one's real easy. Next up is installing our fuel hard lines. Now this just requires unbending them to the factory spec. There's little labels on the end of the curve to tell you where to straighten these tubes out, which makes it really easy. Then we just go under the car, see where everything lines up, and then clip it in using some brackets that are meant to hold fuel lines. Now on this setup, we're putting both the primary delivery line and the fuel return line on because I want to make sure that our fuel pressure stays in check at all times. Now this install took a little bit longer than I'm willing to admit because it is a little bit complex to get these ran the right way if you don't know what you're doing, and as we all know, this is my first time doing this. I've never done it before, so I didn't know where these fuel lines were supposed to go, and I ended up trying to put one of the rear fuel lines on the front for about an hour, only to find out that that's not where it was supposed to go. But finally we got all of our fuel lines hooked in, and it was time to put the fuel tank back up inside the car. So I was about to put the fuel tank back up inside when I noticed this scrape here and a tiny little pinhole here that goes all the way through to the inside of the fuel tank. Now I was trying to figure out why that was there because it clearly looks like the paint was scraped off and then the hole was made, and I'm pretty sure I welded everything. So I went down underneath the car to try and look and see if anything might have made that, and lo and behold, right up there is a little self-tapping screw that I hadn't removed yet, and it punctured through the fuel tank. So we're gonna have to get that pulled out and then re-weld that hole on the fuel tank before we put it back up in there. The only problem is I can't weld anything because my welder is currently in the process of being converted to a proper gas MIG welder. So that's gonna have to wait for a later date. For now, let's get the car back off the jacks, move it around so we have access to the front end, and let's get our transmission leaks fixed. Now, I'm very proud to say that I have successfully traced the cause of our transmission leak back to not one of the seals that we replaced, but instead the kickdown cable itself. Now, this is the original kickdown cable that came with the transmission, and I am not surprised at all that it is leaking still. We did replace the O-ring on it, but it's time to just scrap the whole thing. So we're going to install a brand new kickdown cable while trying not to take off any parts of the Camaro that we don't have to, which means I'm trying to do this about the hardest way you possibly can. But after about 3 hours of laying underneath my car, we did eventually get the new kickdown cable fully installed, and it is working exactly as it should. Now, I'm going to throw it over to the real-world Goblin to explain why this took me 3 hours.
Thanks, voiceover Goblin. Now here I am to visually explain why that was so difficult. See, a kickdown cable on one end connects to the carburetor, and on the other end connects directly to the transmission. Now this is the old one that I had to replace. You can see on one end here, it's all frayed and awful. And that is because it was old and falling apart. So when it would pull out, it would work just fine. But when it was time to push back in, it was really difficult to do that. And because it didn't want to push back in, it made it impossible to get off without cutting the cable in half. Now there's like this much room underneath the transmission between the cooler lines and everything else in there that I had to fit tin snips up in there and cut everything out. Once this was out, it's just trash. But then I had to blindly reach around up underneath the car trying to hook the new cable in. And that connects with just a little tiny hook that's about the size of a needle that is inside the transmission. And if you're trying to do it from up underneath and reaching around in there, it's a pain to get it done. But thankfully, it's all done and over with. That should be the final leak on our transmission fixed, which means we've now fixed the engine oil pan and the transmission, and all we need to do now is test them to make sure that they work. I also lost a ton of transmission fluid while I was taking that out, so we're gonna have to fill that up again too. Now before we go and try to start the Camaro again, we need to make sure that everything else on it is working properly, and that starts with our battery that we've had a ton of problems with over the course of this build. So King Bolin sent me out some products that are gonna help me keep track of just how broken this car really is. So the first tool that they sent me out here is a battery tester that's gonna tell me if this thing is dead, alive, or in how much charge it has left in it. So we're just gonna hook up the negative and the positive, and it turns on. We can go to check and then say it's a 12-volt battery, because it should be, and we're just gonna do a quick test. And it says we've got about 29% of the proper capacity on this thing right now. We're gonna have to hook this thing up to a battery charger and get it ready to crank again. And thankfully, my battery charger is never too far away, because my batteries die a lot here in Florida. Now the second thing that they sent me is this brake fluid tester, which I didn't even know was a thing that you needed to test, so I'm glad I got myself one of these now. What it basically does is you dip this end into the brake fluid and it tells you how much water percentage is in there, because water should not be in brake fluid, and if it's too high, then we gotta replace it. And since I took this car from somewhere very non-humid and brought it somewhere very humid, I think it's a good idea to check and make sure that we don't have a lot of water built up in the braking system. So all I gotta do is open up the hood here, and then we're gonna open up the brake fluid reservoir and dip our tester in. And it's showing about 1% on here, which means that we are totally good. So we're gonna go ahead and close this back up now, and close everything back up. So now we know that we've got to get our battery charged up thanks to our new battery tester, and we know that our brake fluid is all good thanks to our new brake fluid checker. So thanks so much to King Bolin for sending these out. If you guys want to pick up some new extra cool tools for your garage, go ahead and check out the link in the description. We got a special link for you down there to get a little discount.
So with our battery and brake fluid checked out and ready to go, it's time to refill the transmission fluid that we lost during the replacement of the kickdown cable. Now this needed almost an entire quart to get full again, but once it was filled, it was time to start the engine. Now the engine was sounding absolutely awesome, and we had no leaks coming from underneath it at all. Nothing from the transmission, nothing from the oil pan, it was all good. except there is a weird knocking noise, and I have no idea what this is coming from, but if anybody in the comments can tell me, it would be greatly appreciated.
So I've done a little research on that weird knocking noise that the engine has going on right now, and I've narrowed it down to two potential things. One is rod knock, which would be absolutely horrible and mean that I have to pull the whole engine out and see if one of the rod bearings is wiggling around. I hope that's not the case, because when I installed everything, it was all tight and good to go, and I just rebuilt this engine, so I don't think that's a likely possibility. The second option is I have a really cheap eBay fuel pump in there, and I think that fuel pump is banging around and has a really weird noise in it. So I'm going to remove the fuel pump and see if I can get it to recreate that banging noise that I hear when it's running, and if I can, that's going to be our fix. So I don't know for sure, but I think that this might be the source of our sound. There's a lot of play in this lever here, and I'm thinking that that's where our sound is coming from.
Not only is the pump making a lot of sound, but the pushrod is also showing some signs of early wear, which should not be showing up this early into running the engine. Both tips are scuffed, the center of the rod is scuffed, and to me, this looks like it is bouncing around inside the bore because of the slack in that actual pump mechanism.
So now that we think that our fuel pump might be the problem, it's time to purchase another one, and in order to see the results, you'll have to wait till the next video. See ya!